A toddler hears her mother's voice from across the room. Instantly, her face lights up, eyes wide, mouth stretching into a smile of pure, instinctive joy. She doesn't think. She doesn't analyze. The sound alone is enough. That same voice, years later, spoken in a voicemail, causes her adult daughter to weep. The very same sound, two different lives, two very different emotional reactions. And yet beneath the surface, both are deeply human, deeply automatic, and profoundly biological. This moment, simple as it seems, opens a door to one of the most fascinating questions in modern science. Where do our emotions come from? Are they just learned responses, reflections of memory, context, and personal history? Or is there something deeper, something older, happening beneath our awareness? We often think of emotions as reactions, messy, spontaneous, fleeting states, triggered by what's happening around us. Joy, fear, anger, grief. The common belief is that these feelings arise in the moment, shaped entirely by our experience, by the situations we've lived through, by what we remember or forget. But a new wave of science is challenging that assumption, not with poetry or metaphor, but with data, molecular evidence, brain scans, and genetic markers that point to something far more foundational. Because it turns out your genes, the same, ones that determine your eye color, your height, your bone structure, may also be quietly shaping your emotional life. Before you ever felt joy, sadness, or fear, your cells had already begun tuning the instruments. Long before you loved or lost or smiled for the first time, the architecture for those emotions had already been drafted. Think of it like a symphony. The notes haven't been played yet, but the instruments are already there, strung, tuned, and waiting. All it takes is life to enter the room and lift the baton. This changes how we understand ourselves. It suggests that emotion isn't just a response to the world. It's a kind of biological expectation, a readiness, a potential encoded into the fabric of who we are, waiting for the right conditions to awaken it. So when a toddler hears a mother's voice and smiles, or an adult hears the same voice and cries, both reactions aren't just learned, they're partly inherited. The feelings are real, but so is the invisible script written inside us. Long before we ever stepped onto the stage, we are, in ways we're only beginning to grasp, born ready to feel. The story begins in the 1990s, when a global coalition of scientists embarked on one of the most ambitious biological endeavors in history, the Human Genome Project. The goal seems straightforward: map all the genes in the human body, decode the blueprint of life, and, in doing so, unlock the secrets behind countless diseases. But as the data poured in, something unexpected emerged. Alongside genes related to physical traits and medical conditions, researchers began to identify something more elusive: emotional predispositions. It turned out that our genome didn't just carry instructions for how our bodies are built, it also held clues to how we feel, react, connect, and cope. At the heart of this discovery was a growing understanding of how certain genes modulate neurotransmitters and hormonal systems that govern emotion. One of the first and most studied was the 5-HTT-LPR gene, a variation in the serotonin transporter. Individuals with one variant of this gene showed a higher sensitivity to emotional stress. They were more reactive to negative events, more prone to anxiety or depression under pressure. This wasn't destiny, but it was a powerful biological tilt in the emotional landscape. Then came COMT, a gene that affects the breakdown of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive function, decision-making, and emotional control. Certain variants of COMT were associated with faster or slower recovery from stress, particularly anger. In one person, a moment of rage might dissipate like a wave retreating from shore. In another, it might linger, echoing long after the event is over. And then there was OXTR, the gene responsible for producing oxytocin receptors, critical for trust, bonding, and empathy. Some people, it seemed, were more biologically wired to connect deeply, to forgive easily, or to trust quickly. Others were more cautious, reserved not out of coldness, but because of the neurochemical balances in their brains. These discoveries reshaped psychiatry. Depression and anxiety, once framed purely as mental or behavioral disorders, began to be understood at a molecular level. Emotional states were not just fleeting moods, they were also the outcome of a complex interplay between genes, environment, and experience. This didn't negate the importance of therapy or life experience. It deepened it. It gave clinicians a more nuanced framework. For someone with a genetic vulnerability, a minor stressor might trigger a major emotional response. For someone else, the same event might barely register. Understanding this variability is key not only for diagnosis, but for compassion. The implications ripple outward. When we ignore emotional genetics, we risk misjudging people. A child who is highly reactive may be labeled difficult rather than understood as biologically sensitive. A teenager with persistent anxiety might be told to just calm down instead of receiving support that acknowledges their heightened emotional circuitry. A person struggling to connect emotionally might be misread as distant or uncaring, when in fact their oxytocin system functions differently. Without this context, people suffer twice: first from their emotional challenges, and then from the judgment, shame, or isolation that often follows. But what if we embraced this science? What if therapy incorporated genetic understanding to excuse behavior, but to tailor treatment? What if parenting acknowledged emotional predispositions as deeply rooted, guiding how we nurture children's emotional growth? What if criminal justice systems could differentiate between impulsivity, shaped by neurological vulnerability, and deliberate intent? What if empathy wasn't just a virtue, but a reflection of biology and, thus, something that could be cultivated or supported rather than assumed? These aren't speculative futures. They are real possibilities, already beginning to surface in the most forward-thinking corners of medicine and mental health. Because the more we understand the architecture of emotion, the genes, the pathways, the inherited sensitivities, the more precise, compassionate, and transformative our responses can be. What began as a map of the body has become a window into the soul. The turning point came quietly, buried in the data of a massive twin study conducted in Sweden, one of the largest of its kind, tracking over 10,000 pairs of twins across decades. Scientists were interested in emotional traits, how we handle fear, jealousy, anxiety, sadness, and empathy. But what they uncovered was far more profound than anyone expected. Identical twins, even those raised apart in completely different families and environments, showed remarkably similar emotional profiles. One might fear public speaking, and so did her twin across the country, despite never having met. Another cried easily, overwhelmed by sentimental films, and so did his brother. Raised in a different home with different parents, different friends, different lives, their temperaments were not simply shaped by nurture. They seemed to echo something deeper, something inherited. It was an unsettling revelation. It suggested that emotional patterns weren't merely the products of our upbringing. They weren't just reactions to trauma, culture, or parenting style. In many cases, they appeared to be biologically rooted, etched into the nervous system. From birth, crying frequency, sensitivity to criticism, ease of laughter, capacity for trust, aversion to risk traits we assumed were malleable, were at least in part genetically predisposed. And with that realization, a dilemma emerged. If emotions are biologically wired, how much free will do we really have over how we feel? Can we choose to be less anxious if our serotonin transport genes say otherwise? Can we learn to be more trusting if our oxytocin receptors are sparse or misfiring? And if we can't, what does that mean for how we judge ourselves or each other? The questions turned quickly from scientific to in some corners. Controversial, could someone be born with less capacity for empathy? If so, what does that say about moral responsibility? Is empathy a choice or a privilege of neurobiology? Could a person be genetically predisposed to violence? Studies have identified variants like MAOA, sometimes called the warrior gene, linked to increased aggression under stress. Combine that with a traumatic environment, and the risk grows. But if those biological markers are present, who is to blame when something goes wrong? And perhaps most uncomfortable of all, should we test children for emotional risk genes? Imagine a future in which a newborn is screened for variants associated with depression, anxiety, impulsivity, or antisocial behavior. On one hand, such knowledge could allow for early interventions, more sensitive parenting, personalized therapy, careful monitoring. On the other, it risks stigmatizing a child before they've even had a chance to live, a life shaped by probabilities, not choices. These are no longer abstract hypotheticals. With the rise of affordable genetic testing and emotional trait mapping, these dilemmas are already inching into reality. Schools, insurers, even governments may one day be tempted to use this data to protect, yes, but also to predict and possibly control. And so we find ourselves at a crossroads. What began as a search for emotional origins has evolved into a debate about autonomy, identity, and responsibility. We are no longer just asking what makes us feel. We're asking who decides and whether, in the architecture of our DNA, the path of our emotional lives has already been paved. As the science of emotional genetics moves from research labs into mainstream awareness, a new set of cultural and ethical tensions begins to surface, ones that force us to re-examine what it means to feel, to suffer, and to be understood. What happens when emotions, once considered the most deeply personal and human of experiences, are treated like measurable genetic traits? When sadness is scanned for molecular signatures? When anxiety is framed not as a struggle of the soul, but a variation in neural chemistry? Already, the implications are rippling outward. Some insurance companies have quietly begun evaluating the potential of genetic profiling for mental health risk. The idea is alluring. Predict who might develop depression, flag early warning signs, reduce long-term costs. But beneath the promise of prevention lurks a darker possibility: discrimination cloaked in data. If a child is born with genes associated with mood disorders, will that label follow them for life? Will access to care or employment or education be shaped by probabilities instead of reality? The commercial world isn't far behind. Direct-to-consumer genetic testing kits now offer predictions not just for ancestry or disease, but for emotional traits. Some claim they can estimate your likelihood of developing anxiety, your capacity for empathy, even your emotional resilience. The tests are marketed as empowering, know yourself better, but they also risk narrowing self-perception. When a gene report suggests you're predisposed to sadness, do you become more vigilant or more resigned? These modern tensions echo disturbing historical parallels. In the early 20th century, pseudo-scientific eugenics movements argued that emotional instability was inherited. They classified people as feeble-minded based on perceived emotional defects, then used those labels to justify forced sterilizations, institutionalization, and lifelong stigma. Thousands of lives were altered or ended in the name of purity and control. That era taught us how easily biology can be misused when empathy is stripped away. Today's science may be more sophisticated, but the ethical terrain is no less dangerous. Yet ironically, the deeper the science digs, the more it complicates the story. Enter epigenetics, a revolutionary field that reveals how gene expression is not fixed, but shaped by experience. A gene may be present, but whether it is activated depends on environment, context, and even emotion itself. One of the most profound findings in this field came from studies of Holocaust survivors and their children. The trauma experienced during the Holocaust left chemical markers on genes' epigenetic tags that were passed down to the next generation. Children born decades after the war carried biological imprints of fear and hypervigilance. Despite never living through the trauma themselves, the inheritance was not in the genes themselves, but in how those genes were switched on or off. This is the strange and powerful truth. Emotions can be inherited not just through DNA, but through the shadows DNA casts across generations. A child may grow up in love, in safety, and still wrestle with deep-seated anxiety. Their life story doesn't explain it, but their biology might. In one such case, a young girl plagued by irrational fears was found to carry a gene variant affecting fear extinction, the brain's ability to calm down after a threat has passed. Armed with this knowledge, her therapy was redesigned to match her biology. Rather than generic exposure techniques, her treatment focused on repetition, predictability, and body-based calming methods. And it worked. Not because her genes were changed, but because her care finally matched her needs. These stories don't negate the role of environment. They deepen it. They reveal a world where nature and nurture are not in opposition, but intertwined. Our genes set the stage. Our lives direct the play. The emotional truth is somewhere in between. But that in-between space raises profound narrative questions. If our emotions are both inherited and shaped, if they belong to neither genetics nor experience alone, then who really owns them? Who are we when our joy and our sorrow, our trust and our fear are the product of generations past and choices present? Are we still the authors of our emotional lives, or just actors in a play written partly before we were born? This is the modern conflict we face, not between biology and freedom, but between understanding and oversimplification. As science brings clarity, it also brings responsibility, because feelings may be biological, but they are not binary. They are not fixed, or fated, or fully predictable. They are human. And in that mechanism, that blend of code and choice, molecule and memory, we find not just complexity, but the possibility of healing. The revelation doesn't arrive like thunder. It arrives like harmony, subtle, layered, undeniable. Your genes do not dictate your emotions. They don't command how you feel. They conduct. They shape the rhythm, the tempo, the key. But they do not play alone. They need an orchestra. Your life, your environment, your experiences, your relationships. And depending on which instruments show up, nurturing parents or chaotic homes, safety or violence, belonging or isolation, the same genetic melody can sound like triumph or tragedy. This changes everything. That gene variant linked to depression, the one that seems to shadow some people with heavier emotional weather. It's not a sentence, it's a sensitivity, a capacity to feel deeply, to respond strongly to emotional signals. In unstable or neglectful environments, this sensitivity can lead to anxiety, sadness, even despair. But in warm, supportive environments, the very same variant correlates with greater emotional intelligence, heightened empathy, stronger resilience. What we thought was a liability is, in the right context, an asset. This is the twist that rewrites the narrative. Some genes aren't simply good or bad. They are adaptive. They respond to the environment, and their impact shifts. Accordingly, the genetic risk for sadness becomes a gift for emotional depth. A predisposition for fear becomes finely tuned alertness. The difference isn't the gene, it's the life it's paired with, and so emerges a new scientific paradigm, one that refuses to flatten emotion into weakness or code. Emotion, it turns out, is not a flaw in our biology. It is a feature, a function, a force honed over millions of years. Emotions are the brain's oldest language. They are evolution's tuning, fork vibrating through us to signal danger, to deepen bonds, to inspire courage, to draw us closer to what matters most. Fear kept our ancestors alive. Grief bound our tribes together. Joy reinforced what was worth repeating. Love built the scaffolding of trust that made civilization possible. These emotional echoes have been passed through generations, like music, refined by time, sharpened by love, and carried in our cells. You are not just feeling for yourself, you are feeling with the accumulated wisdom of those who came before you. You inherited not just their eye color or height, but their emotional potential, their capacity to feel deeply, to hurt, to hope, to hold on. In the end, genes may write the score, but your life and how you live, it plays the music. Today's science paints a portrait that is both humbling and empowering. Researchers now know that dozens of genes influence how we feel, genes that shape emotional sensitivity, fear processing, stress recovery, empathy, and mood regulation. But none of these genes, on their own, determine your destiny. They are not scripts, they are possibilities, biological potentials waiting to be activated, silenced, or reshaped by the life you lead. This is where epigenetics enters with transformative clarity. It reveals that experiences, especially early ones, can switch genes on or off like dimmers on a light. A gene for heightened stress response may stay quiet in a safe, nurturing environment. The same gene, in a setting of neglect or trauma, may become loud, shaping a life of chronic fear or hypervigilance. The genome is not a fixed sentence, it's a responsive score. Our emotions are not pre-written, they are co-written every day, through experience, environment, and choice. And from this understanding, new solutions are emerging. In mental health, treatments are becoming increasingly personalized. Therapists and psychiatrists are beginning to incorporate genetic information not to label patients, but to customize care. If a person has a serotonin transport gene that affects how they metabolize stress, certain medications or therapies may work better than others. If a child carries markers linked to emotional sensitivity, parents can be guided toward supportive, rhythm-based parenting strategies that help regulate rather than suppress. Some schools are even experimenting, cautiously and ethically, with non-invasive emotional reactivity assessments, helping to identify children who may benefit from quieter classrooms, mindfulness tools, or tailored social-emotional support. It's not about diagnosing, but about adapting. It's about building environments where nervous systems can thrive. But the biggest shift may be societal. For generations, we've treated emotion as a liability, something to be overcome, hidden, or corrected. We've scolded children for crying, mocked men for expressing fear, and pathologized sensitivity as weakness. But the truth is now undeniable. Emotions are biological instruments, honed by evolution, passed through time, and alive in us, not as flaws, but as tools. The nervous system isn't failing when it feels too much tits, often responding precisely as it was built to. This insight demands a cultural transformation. We must stop trying to tame emotion as though it's dangerous, and start learning to tune it like music, like language, like something sacred. Our task is not to silence the emotional self, but to understand it, nurture it, and respond to it with compassion and intelligence. And so, the call is this: know your code, not to blame your anger on a gene or your sadness on a sequence of nucleotides, but to honor what's been passed down, to recognize that what you feel is not random or shameful, it is the invisible music of your ancestors playing through your cells. When you weep, when you love, when you shake with fear or sing with joy, you are not alone. You are the echo of thousands, each one tuning you, shaping you, preparing you to feel fully in the world they left behind. In a quiet concert hall, a young pianist takes the stage. The light falls softly on the keys as she begins to play a melody written decades ago by a man she never met, her grandfather. The composition is old, hand-scribed in faded ink, passed down like a family relic. She never heard him perform it. There are no recordings, only the sheet music and stories of how his fingers used to dance across the piano with both precision and passion. But as she plays, her hands seem to remember. The notes flow not with effort, but with ease, as if the song was already in her. Halfway through, she closes her eyes, and tears rise not from sadness, but from something deeper. Recognition, a sense that this music lives in her not just through legacy, but through something more intimate. Like memory passed through blood, she doesn't cry because she misses him, she never knew him. She cries because something inside her knows this music, feels it as her own, as if playing it is not a performance, but a remembering. And maybe that's what emotion truly is. Maybe our anger, our joy, our fear, our tenderness, these waves that rise and fall within us aren't flaws to be fixed, or mysteries to be decoded. Maybe they're notes in a song that began long before us. Maybe when we feel deeply, we are not just reacting to the world around us, we are echoing the lives before us, carrying their triumphs, their heartbreaks, their instincts and hopes in the architecture of ourselves. Emotion is not chaos, it's continuity. It is the body's way of remembering what the mind can't always grasp. So when you feel overwhelmed, or when you weep without knowing why, when you trust too quickly or rage too fast, maybe that feeling isn't yours alone. Maybe it's inherited. Maybe it's sacred. Maybe it's a kind of ancestral wisdom humming through your nervous system, asking not to be judged, but to be heard, because you are not just feeling your emotions, you are remembering them, and somewhere in your DNA, coiled in silence, waiting. Through time, a quiet tune hums on, and your emotions, they are the voice that finally gives it sound.